I remember my maternal grandfather, Fred Armitage, as a respected elderly farmer living at Hemingbreth in the East Riding of Yorkshire. His family name appears to have its roots firmly embedded in the county. Long before the Armitages became widespread throughout the world, the name was concentrated to the south of Huddersfield in the parish of Armonbury. Here, on land donated by the Knights Templar near the River Holme, marked on this map as Armitage Fold, a hermitage was established where a recluse would lead a solitary life devoted to worship. As the time passed and hermits rejected their lonely existence, they adopted the surname Hermitage. This evolved into the modern name Armitage. Today, the area is known as Armitage Bridge. As the Armitages prospered through the wool and clothing trades, they spread across Yorkshire and beyond. By the mid-18th century, some were well established to the west of Wakefield. Mr. Joseph Armitage of Outwood Hall was buried at Wakefield in November 1750. John Armitage, father of Sir George Armitage of Kirklees, lived at Heath, about 7 miles from Person-Jaglin, in the parish of Featherstone. Person-Jaglin was the home of Joseph Armitage, my grandfather's earliest known ancestor. He was born in about 1728, and at the age of 21 married Ellen, who may have been the daughter of Thomas Woodhead of Snaith. All their 8 children were baptised in the parish church at Featherstone. Joseph, a farm labourer, died at the age of 75. His memorial stone can be found in Featherstone churchyard. It also records the death of his wife Ellen at the age of 95 and 2 of their children, Hannah and William. It seems possible that Joseph and Ellen's eldest son, Joseph, travelled the 7 miles from Perston to Hemsworth in 1785 to marry Elizabeth, the daughter of Samuel and Hannah Yardley. The Yardleys were a family of nail-makers who worked in cottages similar to this at Maplewell in Darnton parish near Bradford. Joseph and Elizabeth had 2 children baptised at Featherstone, Anne and John, and Hannah, another daughter, died at Person-Jaglin in 1788. Their mother, Elizabeth, was buried at Featherstone in 1820, aged 63. Her husband, Joseph, died 8 years later at the age of 74. Joseph and Elizabeth's only known son, John, was born at Person-Jaglin in 1788. At the age of 30, he married Elizabeth, a daughter of William and Sarah Hodgson. John was in his mid-40s and described as an agricultural labourer when the 1841 census was taken. His wife, Elizabeth, had given birth to 4 children. We can discover where the family lived using the tithe map produced 2 years later. At the centre of the village, near the toll bar, a lane led from the chapel to plot 46, described as 2 cottages and garden. One cottage was occupied by John Armitage. It's likely that he was a Methodist and attended the local chapel. That faith was to be followed by many of his descendants. But the chapel and cottages, like the toll bar, are no longer there. They were removed as part of the development of modern Person-Jaglin. Wesley Road, which led from the chapel to John's home, has subsequently been blocked. John and Elizabeth had 7 children, and even though his income would have been modest, the 1851 and 61 censuses show that his children were educated. John died of paralysis at the age of 76. Elizabeth died 4 years later of apoplexy, aged 63. Their third son, John, was born in February 1840. At the age of 11, he was living at Person-Jaglin and described as a scholar. But by 1861 he had left home. The census returns for Gould Fields, a flat marshy area to the south of the Humber, show that he was working there as a farm servant. 4 years later, at Hensel Parish Church, he married Mary, the 17-year-old daughter of Martin and Martha Bell, and granddaughter of Richard and Jane Bell. John settled at Hensel, where he worked as an agricultural labourer. Between 1866 and 1887, John and Mary had 8 children, all born at Hensel. Their eldest son, Fred, was aged 5 in 1871. 10 years later, he was working as a farm servant for Robert Brooke at Hensel. At this time, Leeds was booming through the clothing and wool trades. The population was growing, with the promise of well-paid jobs for those who gave up agriculture. At the age of 23, Fred had become a railway goods porter and was living at Bedford Place in Leeds. In August 1889, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Howden, he married Mary Elizabeth, eldest daughter of George and Sarah Cross, and granddaughter of George and Anne Cross. One of the witnesses was Mary Elizabeth's cousin, Harriet Herbert. Mary Elizabeth, born at Hemingbroof in 1864, was working as an indoor farm servant at Deaton shortly after her marriage. When the 1891 census was taken at Leeds, Fred was described as a railway drayman and living on his own at Newley Street. His wife, Mary Elizabeth, was visiting her parents at Hemingbroof. Only a month after her visit, her grandfather, James Herbert, ended his life by hanging in a garden shed. Fred decided to give up the railway and return to a rural life. After their first child was born, he and Mary Elizabeth moved to Hemingbroof, where he worked as a gardener and agricultural labourer. Altogether they had 5 children: Sarah Annie, Herbert, Harry and Ernest, and a daughter, Gertrude, who was born after the census was taken. Also living in Hemingbroof Main Street was Mary Elizabeth's parents, George and Sarah Cross. He died in 1905 and his wife died 3 years later. Fred Armitage was described as a farmer in 1913 when he and Mary Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Sarah Annie, married Charles Wallace Farrer at the Wesleyan Chapel in Hemingbroof. The following year, the First World War broke out, which led to the 3 Armitage brothers being called up for military service. Only Herbert, the eldest, was to return home. Ernest, the youngest son, was killed in 1916 and buried at Saley Arbois Military Cemetery. He was 19 years old. Harry was killed in 1918, only a few weeks before the fighting ended. He was buried a few miles away from his brother at the much larger cemetery, Vis en Artois. At the age of 69, Fred's mother, Mary, died of apoplexy. Her husband died in April 1922 of chronic bronchitis and cardiac failure, aged 82. Both are remembered by a monument in Hensel Churchyard. Fred Armitage worked hard and became a respected farmer in Hemingbroof, growing a mixture of cereals and vegetables, rearing cows, pigs and poultry. He was a devoted Methodist and trustee of the chapel. Mary Elizabeth made extra money by running a small dairy and selling surplus butter, eggs, cheese and fruit in Selby Market. In 1928, their daughter Gertrude married a schoolmaster, John Thomas Wright, and they had a daughter, Anne Elizabeth. Gertrude died in 1942, and 4 years later, her father, Fred Armitage, died at the age of 80. His wife, Mary Elizabeth, died aged 86 in 1950. The Armitages had made their mark on Heminbrough, playing a leading role in village life. For many years, the house in the main street, Home Farm, was, and I'm sure still is, remembered as the home of Fred and Mary Elizabeth Armitage.